She came home to find a black car parked outside her building, engine running, exhaust curling into the cold like something breathing. She didn't know yet that the girl sitting alone in the back seat would change everything. She didn't know the man who would come looking for that girl had a name people in the city said with their voices lowered, like saying it too loud might summon him. All she knew was a 6-year-old's face pressed to the window, and the particular stillness of a child who has learned that crying doesn't help. Elena Cruz had spent 11 years as an ER nurse learning to read fear in people who couldn't say it out loud. She opened the car door before she let herself think about what that might cost her. She had no idea the cost would be everything she thought she wanted, and everything she didn't know she needed. The car had been sitting outside my building for 40 minutes before I noticed it. I noticed because the engine never turned off, and because in my neighborhood, a car that idles that long is either a drug deal or a stakeout. And I'd learned the difference between the two a long time ago. This wasn't either. This was something else, too quiet, too clean, the kind of black sedan that didn't belong on a street where half the lamps were broken. I almost walked past it. I had 30 minutes to shower, eat something standing over the sink, and get back to the hospital for a double shift I hadn't wanted to pick up but needed the money for. My son's inhaler wasn't going to pay for itself. Then I saw her. A little girl, maybe 6, sitting in the back seat with her seatbelt still buckled, hands folded in her lap like she'd been told to sit still, and had decided, with terrible discipline, to obey. She wasn't crying. She wasn't looking at the door, or the street, or anything that might have suggested she wanted out. She was looking straight ahead, at the back of the empty driver's seat, like she was waiting for someone who wasn't coming back. That stillness was the thing that stopped me. I've spent 11 years learning what fear looks like on a face that's trying not to show it. Adults flinch wrong. Kids do it right, they go somewhere else inside themselves, somewhere quieter, and they wait there. I knocked on the window, she didn't startle. She just turned her head slow, like even that cost her something. "Hi," I said, "are you okay in there?" She didn't answer. I tried the door unlocked and crouched down so I wasn't looming over her. "My name's Elena, I'm a nurse. I work just up the street." I kept my voice low, the same register I use on kids in the ER who have stopped screaming because screaming hasn't worked. "Is someone coming back for you?" "My papa," she said, quiet, certain. "He had to go." "Where?" She shook her head, didn't know or wasn't supposed to say. Either was possible. I should have called the police. I knew that, the way you know the right answer on a test you're about to fail anyway. But something about her, the folded hands, the seatbelt she hadn't tried to unbuckle in 40 minutes, made me think that whoever had left her here might come back fast, and might come back angry. And a squad car might be the worst possible thing she could see next. "What's your name?" "Sophia." "Okay, Sophia, I'm going to sit with you until your papa comes back. Is that all right?" She nodded. I climbed in beside her, left the door open, and we sat there in the cold while my phone buzzed twice with messages from the hospital about my shift starting soon. 12 minutes later, the back door on the other side opened, and a man got in like the car was an extension of his own body. No hesitation, no asking permission of the space he was entering. He had blood on his shirt, not a lot. A line of it, dark and drying, along his collarbone like something had grazed him and he hadn't stopped to check how badly. "Who are you?" he said. Not a question, a demand dressed as one. "Elena, I'm a nurse." "Your daughter was alone." His eyes went to Sophia first, checked her, head to foot, the way I check a patient before I ask them how they're feeling, then back to me. He had the kind of face that didn't move much, like stillness was a discipline he'd practiced until it became architecture. She wasn't alone. She had a driver. There's no driver in this car. Something shifted behind his eyes, not panic, nothing so loud as panic, but a recalculation, fast and silent. He looked at the blood on his own shirt like he was remembering it was there. "You're bleeding," I said. "I'm aware. That's not a graze, that's a laceration, and if you don't let someone look at it, you're going to be back in a car with your daughter sitting alone in it again. Except this time it'll be because you bled out in a parking garage. I don't know where that came from. 11 years of triage, maybe, where there's no room for being careful with men who think they're fine. He looked at me like I'd said something in a language he didn't expect to hear on this street, from this woman in this moment. "You don't know who I am," he said. "I know you're hurt and your kid needs you not to be stupid about it." I nodded toward the hospital, 3 blocks up, its emergency sign glowing red against the dark. "I'm walking back to work right now. You can follow me, or you can bleed in this car a little longer deciding whether your pride matters more than getting back to her tonight." I got out. I didn't look back to see if he was following. I heard the door shut behind me, and then his voice, low to Sophia, "Stay close to me." He fell into step beside me without another word. And somewhere 2 blocks later, I realized my hands still smelled like the antiseptic soap from my last shift, and that smell was the only steady thing in the whole night. My life before that car fit into a 2-bedroom apartment on the 4th floor of a building with a broken elevator, and a landlord who answered texts about repairs roughly never. It fit into a son named Mateo, 8 years old, asthmatic, allergic to the world it sometimes felt like, and a schedule built around his nebulizer treatments and my shift differentials. It fit into double shifts I picked up because single-income households don't have margin, they have math, and the math never quite worked unless I gave it more hours than I had. I want to be clear about something, because the version of this story people like to imagine is romantic from the start, and it wasn't. The man bleeding through his shirt in the backseat of that car wasn't a fantasy. He was a problem walking toward my workplace, and I just volunteered to be the person who solved it. "You're going to need stitches," I told him, once we were inside and I had him on a gurney in a curtained bay, his shirt off. The wound cleaner than it had any right to be given, how he'd been ignoring it. Whoever cut him had been precise, or lucky. In my experience, those 2 things looked the same from the outside. "Fine," he said. "Quickly, I work at the speed the wound requires." He almost smiled at that. Almost. I caught the corner of it before he put it away again, like a man closing a drawer he hadn't meant to open. Sophia sat in the plastic chair against the wall, her coat still zipped to her chin, watching me thread the needle like she was memorizing the motion for later use. She hadn't asked a single question since the car. Most kids her age, dragged into an ER at I check the clock 11:40 at night, would be asking why, "What happened? Are you going to die, Papa?" She asked nothing. She just watched. "Does she always do that?" I asked, nodding toward her without looking up from the suture line. "Do what? Go quiet like that?" His jaw tightened, just barely, a muscle moving under skin that otherwise gave nothing away. "She's tired." It wasn't tired, I've seen tired. Tired kids get cranky, or clingy, or they fall asleep mid-sentence in their parents' arms. Tired doesn't sit with its hands folded for 40 minutes in an idling car without trying the door. But I let it go, because it wasn't my business yet. And because something in the way he said she's tired told me he knew exactly what it was, and didn't want to say the real word out loud in front of her. That was when Rocco came through the curtain. He was built like a man who'd once been a boxer, and had let it go soft around the edges without losing the danger underneath it. And he had a tray of vending machine snacks balanced against his chest like a waiter who'd lost his restaurant and refused to admit it. "Boss, I got you the good chips," not the he stopped when he saw me holding a needle 2 inches from his employer's collarbone. "Oh, hi, I didn't realize we were doing surgery. Should I come back?" "I can come back. Sit down, Rocco," the man on the table said without looking at him. Rocco sat down next to Sophia instead, offered her the bag of chips with the solemnity of a man handing over state secrets, and said, "These are the good ones. Don't tell your papa I let you have 2 bags, he's got opinions about sugar." Sophia took the bag, didn't open it, held it in her lap the same way she'd held her own hands in the car. "You got opinions about sugar now too?" I asked, glancing at him. "I have opinions about everything," he said. "It's part of my charm." "He's recovering from a breakup," Rocco offered helpfully, around a mouthful of his own chips, "with a woman who left him for his cardiologist." Which, in fairness, the cardiologist had better numbers across the board, but I told him, "Rocco, I'm just saying context matters, boss." I bit down on a laugh. Because laughing in a trauma bay at midnight over a stranger's love life felt like the wrong kind of unprofessional, but something in the room had loosened half a degree. And I noticed the man on the table. I still didn't have his name, noticed it too. Noticed that his daughter's shoulders had dropped just slightly, with the snack bag still unopened in her lap. "You're not going to tell me your name?" I said, tying off the last stitch. "No," he agreed. "That's fine, I didn't ask for one." "You're going to want one," he said, sitting up, watching me peel off my gloves. "Before this is over." I didn't know yet what this meant. I assumed he meant the bill, or the paperwork, or whatever insurance complications came with a man who clearly intended to walk out without giving a real name to intake. I had no idea he meant something closer to. "Before your whole life changes, shape around the fact that you opened a car door tonight." His name was Matteo Vital, and I learned it the way most of the city did too late, and from someone else. It was Denise, from Triage, who told me. Her voice dropped to the particular whisper reserved for things you're not supposed to say out loud in a building with cameras. "You stitched up Matteo Vital and you didn't even blink? I didn't know who he was." Elena. That man's family owns half the construction contracts in 3 boroughs, and nobody asks too many questions about the other half. "You don't just," she stopped, looked over my shoulder like the walls might be listening, which, given who we were talking about, wasn't impossible. "Just be careful, okay?" I didn't feel careful. I felt tired and curious, and underneath both of those things, something I didn't want to name yet. A kind of unsettled awareness that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with the way he'd watched me thread a needle like it was the most interesting thing he'd seen in months. He came back 2 days later. Alone, no Sophia, no Rocco, just him in a coat that cost more than my monthly rent, standing at the nurse's station like he belonged there. "I came to pay the bill," he said. "We have a billing department for that. I came to pay it to you. That's not how hospitals work. I'm aware of how hospitals work. I'm choosing not to use the front door." He set an envelope on the counter, thick enough that I knew without opening it that it was more than the stitches cost, more than the visit cost, more than anything reasonable. "For your trouble." I slid it back across the counter. "I don't need to be paid to do my job." Something moved behind his eyes again, that same recalculation from the car. I was starting to recognize it as the look of a man encountering a variable his world hadn't prepared him for. "Sophia asked about you," he said, instead of picking the envelope back up. "She wants to know if the lady with the soap smell is going to visit." Soap smell. Her words, almost the smile again. He put it away again just as fast. "She doesn't warm to people." I should tell you that, so you understand what it means that she's asked twice. Why doesn't she warm to people? He didn't answer that. He looked instead at the hallway behind me, at the rhythm of the ER moving around us. Gurneys, a code called overhead. A kid somewhere crying about a needle. "Her mother isn't in the picture," he said, finally, like it cost him something to say even that much. "She's been raised around men who carry guns and call it normal. I'd like for once for her to be around someone who isn't, and that's me. That's you." I should have said no. I had a son at home with a nebulizer and a landlord who didn't fix things, and I did not have room in my life for a man whose name made my coworker whisper and look over her shoulder. I knew the math of that the same way I knew the math of everything else clearly and without much mercy. "I have a son," I said instead, which wasn't a no, and we both heard that it wasn't. "How old?" 8, asthmatic. "Does he like baseball?" What kind of question is that? A practical one. "I have season tickets I don't use enough." He said it like an offer with no strings, knowing full well, I think, that there were strings, that there are always strings on offers like that. And that I was too smart not to see them and too tired, that week, not to consider them anyway. "I'm not for sale, Mr. Vital. I didn't ask you to be." For the first time since the car, something in his voice dropped its armor, just a fraction. "I asked if your son likes baseball." That's all I asked. He left the envelope on the counter when he walked away. I gave it to the Children's Ward fundraiser the next morning, which felt like the only honest thing I could do with money I hadn't earned from a man I couldn't stop thinking about. That night, on the walk home, I passed the building I grew up in, long gone now, rebuilt twice over since the fire that took it down when I was 19. The fire nobody in my old neighborhood ever talked about, because talking about it meant admitting whose men had probably started it. I told my neighbor Carmen about it once, in passing, the way you mention old scars. I used to live on Haywood, 3rd floor, before the fire. I never thought about it twice. Some stories from that part of the city just lived in the air, unexplained, the way fires sometimes did. I had no idea Mateo Vital had been 23 years old the year that fire started a war that built half of what he was now. I had no idea I'd already told him, without either of us realizing it, exactly where I came from. He started showing up the way weather shows up, not announced, just suddenly present, a fact of the day you adjust around. He'd come to the hospital with Sophia for no medical reason at all, just to sit in the cafeteria while I was on break. Sophia working through a coloring book with the kind of fierce concentration only children bring to things that don't matter. And Rocco hovering nearby with snacks and a running commentary on everyone who walked past. "That guy's got a limp he's overcompensating for," Rocco said one Tuesday, nodding at a passing orderly. "Boss, you see that? That's a man trying to look tougher than his knee allows. Eat your sandwich, Rocco. I'm just making observations." "It's a skill." Sophia looked up at me mid-coloring and said with no preamble, "Do you have a husband?" "No, why not?" "Sophia," Mateo said low. "It's fine," I said. "No, I don't. It's just me and my son." "My papa doesn't have a wife either," she said, returning to her coloring like she'd filed the information somewhere useful. I caught Mateo watching her say it, his face doing the thing it did when something cost him more than he'd show, going stiller, not softer, like stillness was the only mask he trusted. It was 3 weeks later that the closeness happened that neither of us chose cleanly. I'd taken Mateo and Sophia to the small park 2 blocks from my building, Mateo's idea, floated carefully, like he expected me to say no. The kids had drifted toward the swings, Mateo showing Sophia, with the patient seriousness of an older kid who decided to be responsible for someone. How to get momentum without falling backward. "He's good with her," Mateo said. "He's good with everyone, wants to be a doctor or an astronaut, depends on the week." "You raised that." "I didn't raise the astronaut part. That's all him." He almost laughed, a real one, brief, gone fast, like he'd caught himself doing something undisciplined and corrected for it immediately. I watched the kids on the swings, and the late afternoon light went orange across the asphalt, and for one unguarded second neither of us said anything at all. That was when Sophia slipped. Not far, a small stumble off the bottom of the slide, nothing serious, but Mateo moved before either of us had processed it, faster than I'd seen anyone move outside a code blue. And he was at her side, on his knees in the gravel, hands on her shoulders, checking her with the same fast, clinical efficiency I use on patients. Before she'd even finished registering that she'd fallen. "I'm okay, Papa," she said, baffled by the speed of his alarm. He didn't say anything for a second. Just held her shoulders, breathing like he'd run a mile, and I understood watching him. That I was looking at the edge of something he didn't let people see. A fear so total it moved his body before his mind caught up. I crouched down next to them. "She's fine, Mateo, just a stumble." "I know," he said. His voice was rough in a way I hadn't heard from him. "You don't look like you know." He looked at me then, and there was something raw in his face, unguarded for exactly as long as it takes to blink, before he put it back behind the wall. His hand was still on Sophia's shoulder. Mine had ended up, at some point in the last 3 seconds, on his forearm, steadying him without my permission. We stayed like that a beat too long. Long enough that I felt the warmth of his skin under my palm and thought, with the clear, unhelpful honesty I usually reserved for diagnosing other people, this is a problem. He looked at my hand. I pulled it back. "She's fine," I said again, quieter. "I know," he said again, and this time it sounded like he meant something else entirely by it. That night, after the kids were both finally fed and tired and Rocco had driven Sophia home, Mateo lingered at my door longer than the goodbye required. "I need to tell you something," he said. "About why she goes quiet. You don't have to." "I want to." He looked for once like a man choosing his words instead of withholding them. "Her mother used to scream before she left." Sophia learned that going still was safer than being seen. His jaw worked once, twice. I should have stopped it sooner. I didn't know how bad it was until it was already in her. "Mateo, I'm telling you this so you understand why it mattered, that night in the car. That she let you sit with her at all. He looked at me with something that wasn't quite asking permission and wasn't quite confession either, something in between. She doesn't let people close. Neither do I don't know what you've done that we both keep doing it anyway. He left before I could answer that, which was probably the wisest thing either of us did that whole night. The trouble found me before I found the trouble, the way it usually does. It was Carmen, my neighbor, who said it first, leaning over the stairwell railing while I carried groceries up 4 flights because the elevator was, as ever, theoretical. People are talking, Alina. About the car that picks up your boy sometimes, about the man. It's not like that. I'm not saying it's like anything. I'm saying people talk, and some of the people talking aren't the kind you want noticing your address. She said it kindly, the way you'd warn a friend about weather, not danger exactly. Just a forecast worth knowing. I didn't tell Matteo about that conversation. I told myself it wasn't his business, which was a lie I was getting good at telling myself by then. What I couldn't avoid telling him about was the harder thing. The thing that surfaced 2 weeks later when Sophia spiked a fever at school, and the school, lacking any other emergency contact who'd pick up, called me, because somewhere along the way I'd become the name on a list I never remembered signing. I met Matteo at the urgent care with Sophia limp and miserable in my arms, her fever high enough to worry me clinically even as it terrified me personally. And I did the thing I'm trained to do, moved fast, asked the right questions, got her temperature down with the kind of competence that comes from doing a job for 11 years. You didn't have to come get her, Matteo said afterward, watching me check her temperature again with a practiced hand. The school called me. I wasn't going to say no. That's not what I meant. He was quiet a moment, watching Sophia sleep on the exam table, finally cool enough to rest. I meant you didn't have to be good at this. At her. You could have just brought her to me and stepped back. That's not who I am. I know, he said. That's the problem. I understood in that moment that he meant it as the highest compliment he had, and also as a warning. That's the problem because a woman who was good at this, at being steady for a child who needed steadiness, was a woman who could become necessary, and necessary in his world. Was a dangerous thing to let a person become. It was that same week that Rocco let something slip, not maliciously, just carelessly, the way people do when they assume you already know more than you do. You hear about the thing with Salvetter. He asked me, over coffee in the hospital cafeteria. Matteo briefly stepped away to take a call he hadn't wanted to take in front of me. What thing? Rocco's face did a complicated thing, realizing, half a second too late, that I genuinely didn't know whatever he was about to say. Nothing, forget it. Rocco, it's family business. I shouldn't have. He looked profoundly uncomfortable, a man caught between loyalty and the genuine, if clumsy, fondness he'd developed for me over weeks of snack sharing and gentle mockery. Look, there's people in the family who aren't happy the boss is around a civilian this much. That's all I'll say. That's already more than I should have said. I didn't ask Matteo about it directly. I waited instead until that evening when he walked me home from the hospital, a habit that had crept into existence without either of us naming it, and I asked, carefully, "Is someone unhappy that you're spending time with me?" He didn't deny it. He didn't pretend not to know what I meant. "Yes," he said. "Who?" "Family business," he said, and I recognized Rocco's exact phrase used as a wall instead of an answer. "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It's not." We walked the rest of the way in a silence that wasn't comfortable, exactly, but wasn't hostile either, the silence of two people each holding something back. Each aware the other knew it, neither ready to be the one who opened the door first. At my building, he stopped instead of leaving, looked at me with an intensity that felt, for the first time, less guarded than anything before it. "I should walk away from this," he said. "From you. It would be the safer thing for both of us. Are you going to?" He looked at me a long moment. Long enough that I felt the cold of the night and the heat of his attention as two separate, competing facts on my skin. "No," he said. "I'm not." He left before either of us could turn that into something neither of us was ready for yet. I stood in my doorway a long time after, my hand against the frame, feeling something in my chest I hadn't let myself name in years. The ambush came on a Thursday, which felt, afterward, like an insult, that something so violent had chosen such an ordinary day to happen. I was walking Sophia home from the small park near my building, Matteo a few steps ahead, checking something on his phone. Rocco trailing with the easy looseness of a man who'd long since stopped expecting trouble on a residential street at 4 in the afternoon. The car came too fast and too quiet, the way real danger always does in my experience. None of the cinematic screech, just a vehicle that suddenly mattered. Doors opening before it had fully stopped. What happened next happened in the kind of compressed, photographic seconds that bodies remember long after minds have caught up. Matteo's hand on Sophia, pulling her down and back, his body angling between her and the street in one motion that looked rehearsed even though I knew it wasn't, couldn't have been. Not for this exact moment. Rocco's shout. The flat crack of something that took me a full second to identify as gunfire. Because gunfire on a Thursday afternoon near a children's playground was not a sound my mind wanted to process at the speed it was happening. I grabbed Sophia myself, pulled her behind the brick wall of the corner store, covered her body with mine the way I'd cover a patient from falling debris. Pure instinct with no calculation in it at all. She didn't scream. Even then, especially then, she went silent and still in my arms and some distant, horrified part of me understood that this exact silence was the thing her father had been trying to undo in her for years, and here it was, serving her, keeping her alive. It was over in under 30 seconds. The car peeled away as fast as it had come. Rocco was on the ground clutching his arm, swearing with a fluency that suggested this was not his first time being shot at, and possibly not his first time being shot. Matteo was upright, untouched, and looking at Sophia and me with an expression I will never, as long as I live, be able to fully describe. Something past fear, past relief, something that looked. For one unguarded second, like a man watching the only two things he couldn't survive losing. "Are you hit?" he said to me, not "are you okay?" He wanted the clinical answer first, same as I would have asked. "No." "Sophia, no." He had her in his arms now, checking her the way he had at the park weeks before, faster, rougher, his hands not quite steady for the first time since I'd known him. What I saw in the next minute, I will carry for a long time. I saw the man underneath the controlled one, saw him pull a gun from somewhere I hadn't known he was carrying. Saw him scan the street with an efficiency that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with a man fully, terrifyingly capable of becoming whatever the moment required. I saw Rocco, bleeding, already pulling out his phone to make calls in a voice gone flat and businesslike, the comedy entirely drained out of him. Replaced by something competent and grim that told me this wasn't his first war either. And underneath all of it, I felt my own hands shaking, adrenaline cresting and breaking. And I made myself useful the only way I knew how, tearing my scarf into a makeshift pressure bandage for Rocco's arm, my training overriding my fear, because that's what training is for. "You're good in a crisis," Rocco said, wincing, watching me work. "Better than half the guys I know who get paid for this. Stop talking, you're losing blood. I can multitask." Matteo carried Sophia the 3 blocks to my apartment instead of his own. Because mine was closer, and because, I think, in that moment he needed to be somewhere that felt, however briefly, safe in a way his own world no longer did. He set her down on my couch, and she curled into the cushions, eyes wide open, watching him with the same unblinking stillness she'd had in the car the very first night. "Papa," she said. "You're shaking." He looked down at his own hands like he was surprised to find them unsteady. "I'm fine, Piccola. You're not." He sat down on the floor in front of the couch at her eye level, and for the first time since I'd known him, he didn't try to put the mask back on. "I was scared," he admitted to his daughter in a voice that cracked once before he caught it. "I was very scared, and I'm sorry you had to see me like that. You kept me safe," she said. "You're always shaking after, though." "I notice." He went still at that, the particular stillness of a man realizing his daughter had been watching him more carefully, for longer than he'd ever let himself believe. He looked over at me. And something passed between us that had nothing to do with adrenaline and everything to do with the fact that I just watched him be more human in 30 seconds than he'd allowed himself to be in the weeks I'd known him. "Soldier," he said to me, quiet, and it was the first time the word had sounded like anything but cold. "Thank you." For both of them. That night, after Sophia fell asleep on my couch and Rocco had been patched up properly by a doctor who clearly owed Matteo a favor that involved no paperwork, Matteo and I stood in my small kitchen, close enough that neither of us pretended the distance was about anything but choice. "This is what my life costs people," he said. "I needed you to see it plainly before this goes any further. I already knew it would cost something. Knowing and seeing aren't the same." I reached up without deciding to, and touched the line of his jaw where a scratch had opened during the chaos. He went very still under my hand, the way Sophia had gone still in the car the first night, except this stillness, I understood, was not fear. It was restraint, fraying at the edges. "I'm still here," I said. He kissed me then, slow, careful, like a man who'd stopped himself a dozen times before and had finally run out of reasons to stop again. And somewhere outside my kitchen window, the city kept moving like nothing had almost ended that afternoon, like war hadn't just introduced itself to my ordinary life and decided to stay. War, once it starts, doesn't ask permission to escalate. In the 2 weeks after the ambush, Matteo's world tightened around itself like a fist. Guards I'd never seen before stood outside my building at uneven, unpredictable hours. Rocco's arm healed slow and visible in a sling, and he wore it like a grim trophy, joking less, watching the street more. Then they came for Carmen. Not violently, that was almost the worst part, how clean it was. Someone broke into her apartment while she was at her sister's for the weekend and left nothing stolen, nothing broken, just a single, deliberate act. Every photo of her and me together. Every photo from the building's hallway camera that showed her talking to me, gone. A message with no fingerprints, the kind only someone inside Matteo's own organization could have delivered with that precision. "They're telling me they can reach anyone close to you," Matteo said when I called him, shaking after Carmen called me in tears. "Without ever touching you directly, that's worse than a threat. That's a demonstration. Who is they, Matteo? You keep saying family business like it's an answer." He was quiet long enough that I understood the silence itself was the answer, that telling me would mean involving me further in something he'd spent the whole relationship trying to keep at arm's length from my real life. "There are people in my organization," he said finally, carefully, "who think a man in my position can't afford a civilian attachment. They think it makes me weak, predictable. A man with something soft to threaten," his voice hardened. "They're not wrong that it gives them leverage, they're wrong about what it makes me. What does it make you?" "More dangerous," he said. "Not less." I sat with that in my kitchen. My son's homework spread across the table, where I should have been helping him with fractions, instead of having this conversation in a hushed voice on the back porch. I thought about Carmen's photographs, gone without a trace, a warning shaped like nothing at all. I thought about Sophia's stillness, and Rocco's bandaged arm, and the particular exhaustion of a life where danger could reach into your ordinary Tuesday without ever announcing itself. This was the moment. I understood it clearly, with the same clarity I bring to triage where I could leave. Nobody was forcing me to stay. Matteo had never once asked me to choose his world over mine. If anything, he'd spent weeks quietly trying to keep the two separate. Trying to protect the exact ordinary life that was now fraying at the edges because of him. I could take Matteo, move to my sister's in another state, disappear from this slowly enough that no one would call it running. I turned that option over in my mind with real, unsentimental honesty, the way I'd turn over any other hard decision. I did not let myself romanticize the danger. I looked at it plainly. A man whose enemies could reach my neighbor's apartment without leaving a mark, who could not promise me safety because safety wasn't a thing his world dealt in. And then I thought about Sophia, curled into my couch, telling her father, "You're always shaking after, though." I notice, a child who'd learned to watch for danger so carefully, because no one had ever let her feel safe enough to stop. I thought about the particular look on Matteo's face in my kitchen, unguarded, asking nothing, just present. Leaving would be reasonable. It would also mean abandoning the first thing in years that had made me feel like more than a schedule of shifts and bills and survival. I called him back before I'd fully decided, which is sometimes the only way real decisions get made body ahead of mind. "I'm not leaving," I said when he picked up. "Elena," I said, "I'm not leaving. I need you to actually hear that, not argue me out of it for my own good. I've made the decision with my eyes open. I know what it might cost. I'm choosing it anyway." He didn't say anything for a long moment, and when he did, his voice had something in it I hadn't heard before, not relief, exactly. Something closer to disbelief that this particular door was still open to him. "They'll come harder," he said. "Now that they know threatening the people around you doesn't move you. Then we get ready for that." "We," he repeated, like the word itself was unfamiliar weight in his mouth. "We," I said again, and meant it. 2 days later, the message came that made the threat impossible to mistake for anything theoretical. My son's school called not an emergency, nothing had happened, but a man Mateo didn't recognize had been seen near the playground fence during recess, watching, gone before security could approach. Nothing illegal, nothing provable. Just a presence, deliberate and visible, calibrated precisely to terrify without giving anyone grounds to call the police. I held my son that night longer than he wanted to be held, and I felt, for the first time since this began, something other than fear or resolve. I felt fury, clean and total, at a world that thought it could reach my child to make a point about a man's weaknesses. When Mateo arrived that evening, I didn't fall into his arms for comfort. I stood in my doorway and said, "If anyone comes near my son again, I don't care what it costs either of us. You make it stop." "I will," he said, and for the first time, his voice carried something other than calm. It carried promise, and underneath the promise, something close to rage held very carefully in check. "I swear to you, Elena." "I will." They took me on a Saturday, while Mateo was at his grandmother's for the afternoon. Which meant whoever planned it had been watching long enough to know my schedule better than I knew it myself. I want to be honest about how it happened, because the truth is less dramatic than the aftermath made it sound. A car pulled alongside me on my walk home from the pharmacy. A door opened. A voice told me to get in with a calm, almost bored authority that was somehow more frightening than shouting would have been, and a hand at the small of my back made clear that this wasn't a request. I did not scream. I want to say that was bravery. It wasn't. It was the same training that had kept me steady in the trauma bay, the understanding that panic spends resources I might need later. They held me in a room that smelled like motor oil and old carpet. No windows, a single bulb, the kind of deliberate, unglamorous bleakness that exists to remind you that no one is coming to rescue you from a movie set. A man came in eventually, mid-40s, well-dressed in a way that felt wrong for the room, smiling the particular smile of someone who enjoyed being the one in control of a frightened person. "Elena," he said like we were old friends. "I'm Carlo, I worked for Mateo. Until recently, you're the one who's been threatening him. I prefer educating him." Carlo sat across from me, unhurried. "Mateo's father built this family on discipline. On never letting anything soften you. Mateo started forgetting that lesson, and a man in his position who forgets that lesson eventually gets the whole family killed. I'm trying to prevent that. You're an unfortunate but necessary part of the lesson." I did not break. I want that on record. Even now, I did not give Carlo the fear he was so clearly hungry for. I asked him instead, calm as I could manage, "Does Mateo know it's you?" Something flickered behind Carlo's smile, irritation maybe, that I hadn't asked the questions he'd planned answers for. "Not yet. He will. By the time he does, it won't matter." Carlo stood, smoothed his jacket, looked at me with something almost like pity. "You should have left when you had the chance, Elena. Civilians who stay too long in our world don't usually get a second chance to leave." He left me alone in that room for hours, which I later understood was its own kind of cruelty, not torture. Just time enough for fear to do the work that violence didn't need to. I did not break. I thought instead about Sophia's stillness, about how she'd learned that going quiet was a form of survival, and I refused, sitting in that bare room, to let stillness become surrender. I worked the zip tie on my wrists against the edge of the metal chair. Slow, patient, the same patience I'd bring to a difficult IV line, until I felt it give just slightly. It was Rocco who found me, Rocco, who's easy. Joking presence I'd genuinely underestimated, until I watched him kick a door off its frame with the controlled violence of a man who'd been a soldier in this world, long before he'd become my comic. Relief over hospital vending machine snacks. "Took us long enough," he said, cutting the rest of the zip tie with brutal efficiency, checking me over with the same fast competence he applied to everything. "You good? Anything broken?" "I'm fine." "Carlo, it's Carlo." Rocco's face went hard in a way I'd never seen on him. I knew it. I told the boss I didn't trust that smile. Matteo arrived as Rocco was walking me out. And I will not try to describe in detail what his face looked like in the half-second before he saw I was upright and breathing. Because some things deserve to stay private, even in the telling of a story. He pulled me into him hard enough to bruise, and I felt, against my whole body, the violent tremor that ran through him before he mastered it back into stillness. "Carlo," I said, into his shoulder. "It's Carlo. He said your father built this family on discipline, and you forgot the lesson." Matteo went very, very quiet. "He's been the lesson the whole time," he said finally, and I understood, hearing the particular flatness in his voice. That something had shifted in him permanently, that the war that had been circling at the edges of his world for weeks had just located its center, and it had a name he'd trusted for years. "What happens now?" I asked. He looked at me, and for the first time since the night in the car. I saw nothing held back at all, just a man who had just found out exactly how close he'd come to losing the one thing he hadn't let himself admit, until tonight, that he could not survive losing. "Now," he said, "I finish this, all of it, tonight if I have to. I will tell you the part that surprised even me. I was not the one who needed rescuing in the end. I had already got myself out of that room, slow and patient and unbroken, by the time Rocco kicked the door down. What Matteo arrived to was not a woman waiting to be saved, but a woman standing on her own feet, furious and intact. I think that mattered to him more than he had words for. What happened that night, the actual confrontation between Matteo and Carlo, in a warehouse near the harbor, I will not describe in full. Because some of it is not mine to tell. Ended with Carlo's small operation dismantled and Carlo himself in the hands of people who reported to Matteo's family, not the police. Which is its own kind of justice, in a world that doesn't believe in calling the police about anything. Matteo came to my apartment afterward at 2 in the morning, exhausted in a way that went past his body and into something deeper, and I opened the door without asking who it was. Because I already knew. "It's done," he said. "Carlo won't threaten anyone again." I didn't ask for details. There are some things I have learned not to ask, and some things he has learned not to tell me, and that boundary, strange as it sounds, is part of what makes this work. What I did instead was pull him inside, sit him down at my kitchen table, the same table where my son did fractions and I paid bills I couldn't quite afford. And I made him tea he didn't ask for and probably didn't want, because it was the only thing I knew how to do with my hands while my heart was still catching up to the relief of him being alive. Rocco showed up 20 minutes later, looking somehow both exhausted and entirely too pleased with himself. Holding a bag of the same vending machine chips he'd brought to that very first night in the trauma bay. "Figured we'd celebrate not dying with the classics," he said, setting the bag on the table like a man bearing tribute. He had a fresh bruise on his jaw and the energy of someone running on adrenaline and stubbornness in equal measure. "You good, Elena? You don't look like a woman who just got kidnapped. You look like a woman who's annoyed about it." "I am annoyed about it. That's the spirit." He grinned, wincing slightly at whatever the grin cost his ribs. "For what it's worth, you didn't even need us. Boss kicked the door down expecting to find you a wreck, and instead you'd already half loosened your own restraints." Kind of took the wind out of his dramatic rescue. "I noticed," Matteo said dryly, and something in his voice, tired, rung out, but real, made all three of us laugh briefly. The particular laughter that follows very bad nights. Equal parts relief and disbelief that any of us were sitting at a kitchen table at 2 in the morning instead of somewhere far worse. Sophia was still asleep at Mateo's sister's house, blessedly unaware of how close the night had come to changing everything for her too. When Mateo finally spoke about her, his voice dropped into something more careful. "I have to tell her something happened," he said. "I don't know how much. I don't know what's right. You tell her the truth she can carry," I said, "not the whole truth. The part that's hers to know, that you kept her safe, that I'm okay, that the bad thing is over now. You sound like you've done this before. I work in an ER. I tell parents true things in pieces all the time. It's a skill, same as stitching." He looked at me for a long moment, something in his face that I had started, by then, to recognize as the particular way he looked at things he was deciding to keep. "I almost lost you tonight," he said. "Not almost like a near miss, almost like I understood completely, for the first time, what losing you would actually do to me. I've buried people, Elena. I've survived losing people I loved. I don't think I would survive losing you the same way. You're not going to have to find out. I know that now. I didn't fully know it 3 hours ago." He reached across the table, took my hand, turned it over like he was reading something written on my palm. "Whatever's still coming, and something is always still coming, in my world, I need you to know I see exactly what this costs you. I'm not going to pretend it's nothing to make it easier for myself. I already knew what it costs," I said. "I told you that before. I'm still here." Rocco, watching this with chips halfway to his mouth, said, I'm gonna go check on the cars," and excused himself with the tact of a man who recognized. Even exhausted and bruised, when two people needed a room to themselves. What happened after he left was not loud, or dramatic, or anything the rest of the city would ever know about. It was quiet, and it was real, and it was the sound of two people who had both nearly lost everything finally letting themselves believe, just for one night, that they hadn't. The end of the war, when it finally came, was less an explosion than a long exhale. Carlo's faction within the organization didn't survive his fall. The men who'd backed him scattered or surrendered, or, in a few cases I never asked about and never will, simply disappeared from the conversation entirely. Mateo's grip on his world tightened back into the careful, controlled order I'd first seen in him the night his daughter sat alone in an idling car. But he was not the same man. I noticed it in small things. He stopped hesitating before reaching for Sophia when she fell, or stumbled, or cried. The fast, fierce instinct that had once looked like barely contained panic now looked, simply, like a father who trusted himself to catch her. He stopped putting his stillness back on quite so fast after it slipped. He let Rocco's jokes land without correcting the room back into seriousness. The cost had been real, and it had not been small. A man Mateo had trusted for over a decade had turned out to be the architect of the whole war, and that kind of betrayal leaves a wound that doesn't close just because the threat is gone. I watched him sit with that grief in the weeks afterward, not loudly, never loudly, but in the way he went quiet sometimes at dinner. The way his hand would tighten briefly around his glass, when Carlo's name came up in conversations he couldn't avoid. We mourned, too, in our own smaller way, the version of normal life we'd lost along the way. Carmen moved out of our building 2 months later, not because anyone forced her to, but because the fear had settled into her in a way that made the hallway feel different to walk through. And I understood that, and didn't try to talk her out of it, though I missed her badly. I'm sorry, Mateo said, the night Carmen's moving truck pulled away. That's a cost you're carrying because of me. It's a cost we're both carrying, I said. I don't want you taking the whole weight of this by yourself. That's not what I signed up for, and it's not what's fair to either of us. He looked at me like that sentence had landed somewhere unexpected. My father never let anyone share the weight, he said. He thought it was strength, carrying it alone. I watched it turn him into someone I didn't recognize by the end. I'm not your father. And you don't have to become that to keep us safe. It was around then that Sophia started slowly to change too, not dramatically, nothing a stranger would notice, but I noticed. The way you notice a patient's color coming back after days of watching it stay gray. She started answering questions with more than single words. She started, once, laughing at something Rocco said at full volume, an unguarded, delighted sound that made Mateo go completely still at the table. His eyes suddenly brightened away. He turned quickly toward his plate to hide. "She hasn't laughed like that in front of me in a long time," he said to me later, quiet, almost confessional. "Maybe ever. She's starting to feel safe enough to be loud," I said. "That's what this is. That's what you built. By letting things change." The final piece of the war's ending came almost as an afterthought, a quiet meeting between Matteo and the remaining heads of the families who'd once backed Carlo. A negotiation I wasn't present for and didn't ask much about, except that Matteo came home from it looking like a man who had set something down he'd been carrying badly for a very long time. "It's over," he said the night he came back from that meeting. "Not just Carlo, the whole structure under him. I restructured things so no one gets to use my daughter, or you, or anyone I love as leverage again. It cost favors I'll be paying back for years. I don't care. Are you safe now? Safer than I've been since before my brother died." He said it simply, no weight added to the sentence, but I felt the weight of it anyway. The years of grief folded into those 8 words. "I'm not the same man who picked Sophia up that night, Alina. I don't think I want to be him again." "Good," I said. "I didn't fall for him. I fell for whoever you're becoming now." The world Matteo and I built in the months after the war was, almost shockingly, an ordinary one. He came to my son's school recital and sat in a folding chair too small for him, clapping with the genuine, slightly embarrassing enthusiasm of a man who had never once let himself enjoy something this small before. I went to Sophia's school for the first parent meeting Matteo had ever attended without armed men waiting outside, and watched her teacher tell us, with quiet astonishment, how much Sophia had opened up that semester. Matteo and Sophia, against every odd I would have predicted, became something close to siblings, bickering over the television, conspiring against bedtime, Matteo teaching her, with great patience, how to identify constellations from the fire escape outside my apartment on clear nights. It was on one of those nights, the 4 of us crowded onto the small fire escape with mugs of cocoa going lukewarm in our hands, that Matteo asked me to marry him. He did not do it the way the movies do it. There was no ring hidden in dessert, no orchestrated proposal with a string quartet I'd later learn he'd considered and rejected as, in his words, "not us." He simply turned to me. On that fire escape, with our children half asleep against the railing beside us, and said, "I don't want to keep building a life with you informally, Alina. I want it to be real on paper, in front of everyone who matters. I want Sophia and Matteo to grow up knowing this family is permanent, not something that could be threatened apart." "That's not very romantic," I said, though my voice had already started to shake. "I know." He took my hand, the same way he had that night at my kitchen table, like reading something written there. "I'm not going to pretend this is simple or safe or easy. My world will always have risk in it. I can't promise you a life without cost. What I can promise is that I will never again let you carry that cost without me beside you, carrying it too. I learned that lesson late. I won't unlearn it. You're asking me to marry into all of that, knowing everything you know about what it costs. I'm asking you to marry me, not the danger me. Whatever comes after it, I want to face it as your husband. Not your, whatever I've been calling myself for the past year that didn't have a proper word. Soldier's boyfriend," Rocco called helpfully from the apartment doorway, where he'd clearly been listening the whole time with a bag of chips he hadn't even bothered to pretend, was for anyone but himself. "I had money on him sticking the landing tonight. Pay up, Carmen, wherever you are." "I heard that," Matteo said, without turning around. "You were meant to," I laughed, really laughed. "The kind that comes up out of you before you've decided to let it." And looked at this man who had walked into my life bleeding through his shirt and asking nothing of me except, eventually, everything, and I said yes before he'd even technically finished asking the question, because some answers don't need the whole sentence to be true. "Yes," I said, on paper, in front of everyone. "All of it?" He kissed me on that fire escape with our children half asleep beside us and Rocco loudly, unsubtly pretending not to watch. And somewhere below us, the ordinary noise of the city went on, not knowing that anything in particular had just changed, which felt, after everything, like exactly the kind of quiet ending we'd both earned. Soldier, he said again, against my forehead. And the word that had once been cold and clinical in a car outside my building now carried nothing but the whole weight of everything we'd survived to get here. Thank you for not running that first night when you had every reason to. Thank you for not asking me to be anyone other than who I already was. Sophia stirred against the railing, half asleep, and murmured without opening her eyes, "Are you guys getting married now?" "Yes, Piccola," Matteo said. "Good," she said, and went back to sleep like that settled for her everything that needed settling. 10 months later, I am standing in the trauma bay at 2 in the morning, and a man comes through the ambulance doors with blood on his shirt and 4 armed men trying, with limited success, to look like they belong in a hospital hallway. This is not Matteo. This is a stranger, someone else's crisis on someone else's ordinary Tuesday, the kind of patient who would have made every other nurse on shift freeze a year ago in a similar room. He's someone with the same dangerous stillness, the same watchful, armed entourage, the same air of a man used to rooms going quiet around him. I do not freeze, I do not look at the guns. I check his pulse, ask him where it hurts, tell him to hold still while I find the source of the bleeding, the same way I would for anyone whose name I didn't know yet. The same way I did the very first night this whole life began for me. He looks at me, startled by my steadiness, the way Matteo once did. "You're not afraid," he says. "I've met scarier men than you," I say, and behind the curtain, where he's been waiting for his own follow-up appointment with his daughter's pediatrician, I hear my husband laugh, low and warm. At the joke, he understands better than anyone else in this building ever could. That's the thing about the moment I keep doing, the thing that started it all, the thing I did without thinking the night a frightened child sat alone in an idling car. I still do it. Without meaning to, without performing it, I am still the person who keeps working when everyone else in the room freezes, who treats danger like a clinical fact instead of a reason to run. Matteo tells me, later that night, walking home with Sophia's hand in his and my hand in his other, that watching me in that trauma bay still undoes something in him every time. "I used to think it was bravery," he says. "That first night, I've had a year to watch you do it again and again, and I don't think it's bravery at all. I think it's that you've simply decided, every single time, that the people in front of you matter more than the fear does. That's a harder thing than bravery. I don't think I fully understood that until tonight, watching you do it for a stranger. You're going to make this into something bigger than it is. I'm allowed to. You're my wife." He says it like he still hasn't gotten over the privilege of the word. "I get to make everything you do sound enormous. It's one of the few perks of marriage no one warns you about." Sophia, 7 now, walking between us with the loose, unguarded gait of a child who has spent a year learning that the ground beneath her is steady, says, "Is it okay if I tell people my mom's not scared of anyone?" I feel that word, mom, land the same way it has landed every time she's used it in these past months, soft and enormous all at once. A gift I will never stop being moved by. "You can tell them whatever you want, Piccola," Matteo says before I can answer, and I hear in his voice the particular gentleness reserved only for her. That night, after both kids are asleep, Matteo and Sophia sharing the same bunk room they begged for after the wedding. Against all reasonable predictions about siblings who started out as strangers, Matteo and I sit on our own fire escape in our own apartment. In the ordinary middle-class life, he chose over the empire his father built, because in the end, he restructured enough of his world that this was possible. Smaller, quieter, safer, still his. Still ours. The smell of antiseptic soap is still on my hands, faint, the way it always is after a shift, no matter how many times I wash. He used to notice it first thing, that first week, before either of us knew what it would come to mean. "Soap smell," he says now, lifting my hand to his mouth, the same word Sophia first used to describe me to him a year and a lifetime ago. "Still there," I say, "probably always will be." 11 years of habit doesn't wash out. "Good," he says. "I'd miss it if it ever did." We sit there a long time, not saying much else, the city moving below us the same indifferent way it always has. Not knowing or caring about any of the war that once nearly tore through this exact quiet. I think about the girl who sat so still in that car, learning that silence kept her safe, and the woman, asleep down the hall now, who has spent a year learning the opposite lesson, that being loud. Being seen, being laughed at the dinner table loved, is safer still. I think about the soldier I used to be called coldly, and the soldier I am called now, warmly, fully, by a man who learned, the hard way, that some battles are worth fighting beside someone instead of alone. There is no danger left waiting in tomorrow that either of us knows about. There is only this: a quiet rooftop, a sleeping house, and a love that cost both of us everything we thought we couldn't survive losing, and gave us back more than either of us thought we still had room to want.